The Profile. You're listening to Premier Christian Radio.
Welcome along to today's edition of The Profile with me, Justin Brierley. And this is the programme, of course, brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine as part of our Faith Explored programming every Saturday afternoon. And if you'd like to get a free sample copy of the latest edition of the magazine, you can find it at premierchristianity.com/free sample. Well, in this first part of The Profile today, I'm really overjoyed to be joined by two men who are both involved in a film coming out this summer. In fact, it's called Summer in the Forest. Randall Wright, the director, and Chris Asprey, who's been involved in the production, are both with me. And, we'll be finding out all about it across the course of today's programme. It's based on looking at the story of L'Arche, which is a community established by Jean Vanier to bring together people with learning and mental and physical disabilities and those who are part of that community with them, able-bodied people, but who form a community which helps to bring humanity to all involved. We're going to be learning more about the film. First of all, let's meet the director, Randall, and Chris. Great to have you both with me, gentlemen.
Thank you, Justin.
It's great to have you. Randall, you have been driving this film, obviously. I don't know how long these things tend to take, but when did you sort of first get the idea for a film looking at the story of L'Arche?
Well, quite a long time ago. I was very lucky. I met Jean Vanier in St Pancras Station, and he was very impressive, rather sort of quiet, but also with a sense of humour. He looked like a sort of Jacques Tati come back to life, very sort of tall and very sort of deep, inquiring and friendly face. Now, I was very, very impressed by him, but the thing that made me want to do it was a moment of truth, really, for me, when I went to L'Arche, London, and there was an evening where all the families were invited, the families of the people who had been looked after in L'Arche. And I was very moved because I come from a very pretentious world, I should say. I come from the world of film and television. And here was a world where no one was pretending. There was something very precious about that. And I was looking for a subject which challenges the world we're in, a world where we are expected to perform, we're expected to be a success.
Yes.
But success seems very superficial sometimes, and of course people fall short.
Jean Vanier, tell us who he is and what it was that he founded, I guess some 50 or so years ago now. Yes,
a little bit more than 50 years ago. May I just describe the film?
Of course.
What you've described with L'Arche is very important, the story of L'Arche. But the idea of the film, which relates to the story of L'Arche, is to provide for people a cinema film, a very entertaining film. It's a very beautiful film, shot as if a fiction film. It's widescreen, incredible sound, fully orchestrated. It's not a worthy documentary at all.
Right.
But it's the stories told by some of the pioneers of L'Arche, including Jean, of how they made their home. So you asked me to tell you the story of Jean. Well, there are several parts to that. The one that people usually start with, which I wouldn't choose to start with, but I think they often start with, is the moment he rescued these pioneers in 1964. In fact, the film, and one of the things that really impressed me was a lot of those pioneers are still there, more or less in the same houses they were transported to from a lunatic asylum near Paris. When I say pioneers, these are people with intellectual disabilities who, as it were, in the previous way of thinking about those people, were a great embarrassment. They were people who were rejected and marginalised.
And put out of sight and mind, essentially.
Exactly. So Jean did something which we now might see as sort of fairly common sense, but then was revolutionary. He went into the lunatic asylum, he observed these people, and he realised that the people who were in there included people who didn't need to be there, who would be perfectly happy living in an ordinary house, in an ordinary community, if you like. And so he took those people out, and I think a lot of people saw that act as a sort of experiment. But he proved, that it was possible, and then I think the key part of the story, that in that act as a Christian, and I think he thought he was doing something very good, which he obviously was. But what he discovered was the relationship with these people he'd rescued was mutual, and in fact, they changed him. Yes. They helped him.
They rescued him as much as he.
They did.
Rescued
and so
them.
The real beginning of the story for me is really to do with Jean Vanier's response to the Second World War, to the sort of sense of liberation, of a sort of victory over evil fascism, if you like. But I think Jean, who's such an extraordinarily honest and complete sort of person, he sensed, in a sense, there hadn't really been a victory in that it was still an open question as to what it is in our natures that leads us to do sort of evil things
to each other, and can we see the humanity in people who are very different to us?
Exactly,
on the
and
surface.
so by finding the people who were rejected, another category of people, he was there when some of the Jews came back from concentration camps, and with his mother helped them. But could he found another category of rejected people, and eventually there was a long journey, and I think in encountering them, he then finally had his liberation, which is a liberation from sort of accepting himself and his vulnerability and human nature. I mean, I don't know if you...
Well, let's bring in Chris at this point. We will, in a moment, hear a couple of clips from the film Summer in the Forest, which tells the story of the L'Arche community, which began, as you say, in France, now has communities all over the world doing the same thing under the same kind of ethos of allowing those who have mental and physical disabilities to live in community with people that perhaps might be called carers, but who are not, in that sense, it's not a sort of client professional relationship, Chris, and you're part of L'Arche London. Do you want to explain how you got involved?
Well, how I got involved, that's right. In fact, we don't call people who work at L'Arche carers, as you said, precisely for a reason that Randall alluded to earlier, which is that carer does imply a sort of one-way relationship, and in a way, of course, we are looking after people. That is very much part of what it is to be someone with a learning disability. It's that you do need care. But in a way, the kind of distinctive experience of L'Arche is that it wants to provide, I think, the setting for a reversal of that relationship somehow. So that although I have the experience of looking after whoever it may be, Patrick in the film, for those who are going to see the film, Patrick, needs help with his bath every morning. And in that sense, Patrick is a dependent human being. And yet, I, for 2 years, lived in a room right next to Patrick, in the room next door to him, and Patrick became, I would say, something like a friend. I mean, it's really difficult to talk about friendship, I think, in cases like this, because I think a lot of the time our conception of friendship is based on an idea of equality. And actually, what's strange about the friendships that people with and without disabilities make with each other is that often it's a friendship which crosses inequalities. And that is the kind of weird and beautiful thing that I think I discovered there. Yeah. So you asked how I got involved. I was actually an academic in Paris. So I used to teach theology and religious studies.
Not that different to Jean Vanier himself in that sense.
Perhaps in that sense, yeah. In fact, quite a lot of people over the years, another sort of well-known name is Henri Nouwen.
Indeed, yes.
Who've been intellectuals or involved in university life at some level, have been attracted to L'Arche. For me, I'd been teaching for 5 years in Paris. I I was in need of a break. I was granted a sabbatical by the university, and I spoke with the head of department. I said, I'm really keen to spend a year at L'Arche. And by this time, I'd actually become friends with a L'Arche community about an hour from Paris, the one that's in the film, the Trolley community, which is the first community. And that was through a colleague at the university who lives opposite one of the houses. And I remember he'd invited me back to stay with him and his family one weekend. He's in the philosophy faculty. I was in the theology faculty. And he invited me back to stay with his family. And when I got there, he said, why don't you go for lunch in one of the houses? So I said, OK, that sounds interesting. And I remember turning up in one of the houses, and I walked in through the door. Someone said, top of the road. So I walked in through the door, and then I opened the door, and there was no one around except this woman who I suppose was probably in her 30s, 40s at the time, called Fanny, I would discover, who was non-verbal. And she was sort of... Fanny used to sort of... how can I describe? Drag her way around the house, really. She didn't want to be in a wheelchair, but was unable to walk without support. And she would sit at the door and make these sort of noises when people would walk in, which I suppose were Fanny's way of welcoming people. Anyway, so I walked in. There was Fanny sort of crouching, lying by the door.
You weren't quite sure how to respond.
I wasn't quite sure how to respond. I felt this was my first real contact with someone with a learning disability. And anyway, I was invited for lunch, and I sat round the table. There must have been about 10 people at table, and because I was the guest that day, people were keen to know who I was, where I came from, and I talked a bit about myself and felt incredibly uncomfortable. And then at the end of the meal, I had this really strange experience, because everyone got up and started doing their tasks, and everyone, it became quickly apparent, had their own sort of job in the house. It was one person's job to clear away, it was another person's job to wipe the table, and so on. So I was standing around like a kind of... spare part. And a guy called Olivier, who's a man who's been around in that community for more than 25 years now, a man with Down's syndrome, and very gentle man with a sense of humour, can be quite difficult at times as well, I would discover. But anyway, Olivier saw that I was standing around like a spare part and just took me by the arm and showed me what to do. And it was really weird, because in a way it was a tiny thing, but kind of encapsulated the sort of experience that Randall described Jean having, that I was in that moment taken care of by someone with a learning disability in a very small way, but saw that I was the one not knowing what to do and needed, in a very small way, some kind of welcome and looking after. And that for me was the beginning of a friendship with L'Arche.
Let's hear a little from the film. This is just a couple of extracts from the film Summer in the Forest.
What is it to be a human being? Is it the power? If it's power, then we're going to kill each other. See, the wise and powerful lead us to ideologies, whereas the weak are in the dirt. They're not seeking power, they're seeking friendship. It's a message for all of us. It's about all of us.
Just a little of Jean Vanier and some of the audio from the film Summer in the Forest. If you want to find out more, summerintheforest.com. It's actually playing in selected cinemas from around the end of June, beginning of July, and in that sense, Randall, what are you hoping that those who go to see it will come away with? I mean, this isn't a film where you just want to sort of, let's all just feel sorry for a group of people. That's certainly not the kind of thing you want to put across through this film, is it?
No, it's. I hope it's enormously entertaining. It's it's an opportunity to meet people you wouldn't otherwise perhaps meet, or as we find with a lot of people, that there's some indirect relationship with intellectual disability. and it reminds them of something that they wanted to find out. But no, it's the absolute opposite of a kind of worthy film. It's very empowering and optimistic. It doesn't shy away from darker stories. A lot of the stories are of liberation, but they include, for example, in the case of an amazing man called Michel Petit, who's someone and certainly I ignored initially. He's very unprepossessing, and yet he's the most incredible man who escaped from an asylum. He broke out. He walked 30 kilometres back home, and then he smashed up his home as a demonstration of how incredibly unhappy he was. And his family recognised how badly cared for he was. And by extraordinary coincidence, because I think most of the people who had that experience would have been sent back again, there was news that Jean Vanier had established the house in Troley, and he was able to go there. So he tells this story, but he also expresses his philosophy of life. He talks about history. Gradually, we enter into, his confidence, and I hope people's experience of the film is that they discover their own humanity in a sense. I mean, what I think, I don't know if it's, I don't want to summarise what you said, Chris, but everybody experiences this part of life differently. But for me, it's a sort of encounter with yourself. You have to discover, to sort of stop pretending. You discover in yourself a kind of shared vulnerability, and there's a sort of change in time scale. I don't know. I grew. I got. Sorry, I'm trying to find the word, but I think I started using my intuition a great deal more in relating to people, and I found that I developed a lot more patience, because I think I'm an incredibly impatient person.
I remember reading how Henri Nouwen, for instance, he described it, I think, in his memoirs and so on, as a very humbling thing in the sense that all his degrees and intellectual abilities and so on, which in a sense he'd based a lot of his self-esteem and identity in up to a point, sort of none of that counted really for anything, and you were just, it was just who you were at rock bottom that counted when you were in that kind of a community.
I mean, I wasn't as successful an academic as Henri Nouwen, but nevertheless it was I think quite a shock to the system when I sort of decided that I would join the L'Arche community as a full time, that this was going to be my life at least for a period of time. Kind of a bit of a drop in status, and also I think that the reality is that your degrees count for nothing there. What is a measure of success is not that you've written something or published something or whatever, but actually your ability to relate to people in a mature way. And community life puts that to the test in all sorts of ways that I didn't imagine. And
I mean, I'm sure it's not all, butterflies and roses. I'm sure there are frustrating and challenging times every day.
Yeah, I mean, Jean Vanier sort of often likes to say that community is about celebration. And I once sort of said to him, "Oh gosh, that seems a bit of a shortcut, Jean. That's not the experience I'm having at the moment." And then he sort of made his thoughts a little bit more precise, and I've heard him do this on other occasions as well. Celebration is the sort of end of that road of being in community together, so that what we're aiming at is celebration, and actually what we achieve a lot of the time is celebration. And I think in the film, the film sort of ends actually on a note of massive celebration. There's a big party, and one of the things that for me was just, I think, transforming about being an assistant in a L'Arche house for 2 years was the almost sort of anarchic at times. You probably can't say that, but it doesn't sound very professional. But almost anarchic celebratory atmosphere. That we enjoyed each other's company beyond the norms and the laws and the obligations and tasks and that had to be performed. and we were able to tease each other, and there was a genuine affection, and it felt, in some sense, like being part of a family.
In a sense, in a way that you sometimes don't get the opportunity to.
And I might just jump in here, because that's the spirit that inspired the film. Chris was an amazing help to me, and someone called Mary Alex. They were sharing leadership of the house. And I went in as a complete beginner. So I work with an amazing cinematographer called Patrick Duval, and he and I had been in all sorts of straits and difficult parts of the world. We worked for several weeks in Niger, hundreds of miles from anywhere. So we're used to sort of being dumped down somewhere and feeling uncomfortable. But what we started to realise, and seeing how open Chris was and others were to having a relationship and being patient and noticing that we had to drop all our usual filmmaking methods, which are actually to do with telling people what to do. So we couldn't tell anybody what to do. We had to wait until things were offered to us by individuals that were their story or some explanation of what they felt, and then build the film out of that. Yeah. So the film is very, I think, unusual, dare I say, but it's very unusual in a sense in reversing the usual image of disability. The things we were talking about earlier, a lot of people represent disability as a burden.
Yes.
So we all know, when you ever bring up that word, that there's going to be a problem somewhere. Someone can't walk easily, so it's a practical problem to solve at least. And then there's the anger that might be there, frustration. But what I discovered personally, and was so extraordinarily liberating in Trolley, was that the person who was going through that struggle was welcomed and secure at home, and they had gradually in their life discovered themselves and a place. And that's, in a sense, the shape of the film. That's what the film's about.
Yeah. Fantastic stuff. We've only got a few minutes left, and I'd be interested in your commentary, Chris, just as we start to draw things together. This isn't, quote-unquote, a Christian film. Anyone of any faith or none, I'm sure, will find this engaging and helpful. You are a Christian yourself. I don't understand that there's any kind of particular, you don't have to be a Christian to be involved with the community and so on. But what did it, for you as a Christian, sort of tell you? What has your experience kind of brought to you about the nature of faith, about Christ, about what happens in community when this happens?
Quite hard to put my finger on, Justin. I would probably, one word really, reality. So it's the way in which my faith became something real, rather than
a theory,
a set of theories, beliefs, abstract beliefs. I think that perhaps I, and maybe a lot of people today, have or tend to lead quite a sort of individualistic faith life, and a relationship with God in some sense can be quite comfortable when it's engaged in individually, because God is very gentle and doesn't answer back, and doesn't intervene in dramatic ways, except perhaps very exceptionally for some people, and yet somehow the measure of how you are with other people is the measure of the reality of that relationship you have with God. It's a kind of, I would say, a sort of a litmus test, if you like, of the state of where your faith is, and it might be that your faith is thriving. It might be that your faith is struggling. What I think living in community did to me was it gave me a real litmus test, so that I could actually. I could be real about that.
I guess you can know all the theology in the world in your head, but when the rubber hits the road, will it actually make any difference to who you are as a person and the life and the relationships you can have?
That's right, and thank you. Yeah, and actually, my sort of interest was in contemporary Christian doctrine, and I think a lot of doctrine, a lot of theology is actually theology made for intellectually very competent people, and only part of someone without a learning disability, only part of me is intellectually competent. I'm many other things than just a mind. And, I'm a body, I'm emotions, I'm made up of all sorts of other things and experiences. And at that point, I found that my theology had very little to say and had become quite poor, effectively. And I think this, for me, was a chance to experience faith in a more whole way, perhaps in a way that was more challenging and perhaps less obviously Christian. But it had that merit of actually being real.
It's been fascinating to be able to talk to you both. Randall Wright, the director of this new film, Summer in the Forest, and Chris Asprey of L'Arche London. Thank you very much for joining me on The Profile today. It's been great to have you. And can you just remind us, Randall, of how people can see the film over the coming month or two?
Yes, it's released on the 23rd of June at Picture House. It's showing in a number of cities. You can find out where by logging into online on summerintheforest.com. And then in the future it'll be available at a reasonable price online.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in to tell us about it, and all the very best as the film gets released.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the first half of today's Profile with me, Justin Brierley. Don't forget that you can find out more about the film. We've been talking about Summer in the Forest. Summerintheforest.com for more information. The Profile brought to you in association with Premier Christianity magazine, and if you want to find out more about that, do go to our website as well, premierchristianity.com. Coming up next, the second half of today's programme.
The Profile, in association with Christianity magazine, on Premier Christian Radio.
Where faith comes to life.
Welcome along to the programme. I'm Justin Brierley, and my guest joining me on the second part of today's Profile is Craig Hazen. Craig, thank you for joining me today.
So good to be here.
It's great to have you. Craig, anyone listening will immediately be able to tell, you're not from round these here parts in the
That's
UK.
Right. Just on a visit.
You're a resident of SoCal, South California.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about what you do there out in California.
For the last 15 years, I've been running a graduate program in Christian Apologetics. It's a Master of Arts degree. It might very well be the biggest one in the world. And it's really been kind of a center point for people who want to learn how to have a reasonable faith and defend their faith against all kinds of opposition.
Great stuff. For those who aren't aware of what the word apologetics might mean, can you just give a quick definition of what that is?
Yeah, it really is a simple idea. Unfortunately, people get it confused with giving apologies, like I'm sorry, but it really is a grand old term meaning to give answers, to give reasons for your beliefs. It's that simple.
It's that simple. Take us back then, before we get up to the present day and what you're doing. Did you grow up yourself in a Christian family?
You know, I didn't. We occasionally went to church. I remember going to a church as a child occasionally, and it did make a lot of sense to me. And so by the time I got to high school, I was in my, I was 16 or 17 years old. I was a bit of a village agnostic, if not a village atheist, and so I'd ask the believers the hard questions and watch them crumble, and it was clear that there wasn't anything to that, and that religious belief was just something you closed your eyes and leapt into, and just hoped it was true. I just wasn't interested in that, and I was heading towards a university science education, so that seemed like a much more reasonable place to go.
So what changed? What happened?
So some girl invites me to a church, and you can imagine the attraction right there. Some girl invites me to a church. I'm fine. I'll go, and I enter this church, and I was clobbered. I really was. I just did not expect what I was going to hear.
What had been your expectation then of church and Christianity?
Well,
up to that point?
this I don't know what kind of churches your listeners are going to, but this was a big Calvary Chapel in Southern California, the mothership of Calvary Chapels. And on Monday nights, they had a special evangelistic service where this fellow by the name of Greg Laurie, who's still pastor of a big church in Southern California and a global evangelist. He was preaching on a Monday night, and these were always evangelistic services. And there was a guy named Keith Green who was playing the piano that night.
Keith Green.
Yeah, that's a blast from the past.
Keith Green, yeah, that's the name.
And so I was so impressed with the music. And then this message, I remember he preached on John chapter 4. I remember it to this day. And something grabbed my heart. I was just grabbed by this, and I didn't know what it was. But being a kind of scientifically minded person, I decided to take the experiment. It was almost too sterile and rational, really. But in fact, they were singing some sort of hallelujah chorus. As they were getting people to stand up and go forward for an altar call. Well, just for drama, this girl, I know she was praying for me. She was going to get a notch on her Bible for sure. And I waited till the last hallelujah before I got up and went forward. And I was dying to just turn around and look at her face, But I went up and said some prayer, and then they sent me to a back room, along with the other new believers, and there were counselors in this back room, and for each counselor there was a whole circle of new believers, and they were giving them a pep talk and giving them a Bible and saying they were going to pray for them, and after about 20 minutes it was me with all the counselors, and I was just peppering them with questions, and God bless them, they did their best to answer those questions, but they didn't really have much training, but they didn't leave it there. They gave me book titles and radio programs to listen to, and sent me cassette tapes by Christian thinkers, and over the next, days, weeks, months, there was this strange chord developing between my mind and this heart experience that I'd had. Suddenly it dawned on me, oh my goodness, this is actually true. This isn't just some experience. And that really set a trajectory for me. That still obsesses me today, that this is really true. This is not a figment of my imagination. This is not about leprechauns or unicorns. This Jesus fellow really was the Son of God and the Savior of humankind.
Yeah, fantastic. So at what point then, after having had this conversion and starting to put together this emotional tug you'd had with the case for Christ and stuff, did it start to develop into a calling on your own life in this area?
It did. Any young Christian who's really passionate about God might think about the pastorate, becoming a pastor, a Christian leader of some sort. The Lord tossed me out of that in no uncertain terms, and I really just stayed in my academic focus. And although I wanted to go do maybe theology or religious studies or philosophy, because I was just drawn to that through this new Christian experience, I finished an undergraduate degree in biology, and I'm really glad I did. But I did take every philosophy and religious studies course I could find. But the Lord was developing me for some future ministry. And I've always loved not just science, but the philosophy of science, the history of science, and how that interacts or weaves together with religious belief.
Sure, absolutely. And were there kind of significant people in your life at this point, Christians, who were helping you sort of discern what the future might hold, what kind of giftings God had given you in this area?
Yeah, there were more people telling me what not to go into. You are no counselor, to stay away from people's psychological problems. But in terms of evangelism and being passionate about the truth of Christianity and the fact that there's a bedrock of evidence and reason underneath it all, that they recognized immediately. And there's not a friend I had back then, who I still have today, who is surprised in the direction I went.
These days, obviously, there's been a growth in the amount of skepticism, particularly that you can contact online. That seems to be where atheism sort of congregates, if you like. It's very much an online phenomenon almost, and you have the key spokespeople. It
really is.
Back when you were starting out, was that kind of as much of a going concern at that time? What kind of issues were being thrown at you that you were trying to answer?
Wow, what a good question. It's hard to go back, because I was so obsessed with my own objections and working those through. It was hard to take a real temperature as to what was going on. But I became a Christian in the late 1970s, and I mean, I remember some of the controversies when I first became a Christian, and they're not controversies anymore necessarily.
Sure.
I mean, there's still a generic form of unbelief that circulates, but I don't think anything's changed in this regard. That if I were to identify the biggest and most pervasive apologetic problem, it's simply this: unbelievers think that what we are engaged in is blind leaping. That we close our eyes and we leap into religion. That's what it's really all about. And so they'll say things like, well, good for you. So glad you have that Jesus thing going. But I'm more of a scientific person.
As though the two are mutually exclusive. Yeah.
That just gets to me, And so I go overboard trying to show how rational Christianity is sometimes, because that is what we're facing.
Sure, absolutely. And that's kind of obviously where your ministry is developed. So tell us a little bit about how you got involved at Biola, which is where you're based out of.
Yeah, well, back to college, I finished in biology. Like I said, I took every philosophy and religious studies course I could, but I started going to this funny little school called Simon Greenleaf University. Simon Greenleaf was a Harvard law professor who wrote a wonderful little book called The Testimony of the Evangelist. And one of my old professors by the name of John Warwick Montgomery started this school, and it was just down the street from me. So I wasn't even serious about doing a degree there, but I went and started taking these graduate level courses, even though I was still an undergraduate, and I loved every second of it. So I got some great learning in systematic theology and philosophy of religion and all the apologetics courses that I could possibly enjoy. But it was then I decided I'm not going in. I thought maybe of becoming a scientific researcher or something like that. But I decided to shift gears and take my science along with me, but move into religious studies and philosophy. Okay. And so I did an MA and a PhD in religious studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara, which is an unusual place to study. I mean, I could tell hours of stories of being a Bible-reading, Jesus-loving Christian in this very hostile environment, to my belief, and how the Lord worked through that. But that really set the trajectory for me, and so I ended up with a degree, a couple of graduate degrees in religious studies. So I got a chance to study all the great world religious traditions from stem to stern, and religious studies is quite a flexible banner under which to study. Yeah. And so I got a chance to do everything I loved in graduate school.
Excellent. And so graduate school, what did that develop into? Did it engender a passion for doing an academic career?
It really did. I pictured myself at a secular university, doing that thing where as a Christian you kind of lay low. You don't do anything particularly Christian until you get tenure, and then you can really make a nuisance of yourself for Jesus in all the right ways. I think one of my just recently dear departed colleagues, Dallas Willard from the University of Southern California, who did that more brilliantly than anybody. Just was a huge Christian presence on a secular university campus. It's just a light in a very dark place.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the sort of Dallas would be a good place to start, and how his kind of ministry impacted you in the course of your life. The way that he was obviously bringing a public engagement with Christianity into a sometimes secular atmosphere.
Yeah, Dallas Willard. My goodness, he's the boy. He had a tremendous influence on me and some of my dearest colleagues too. But it was more the fact that this man, he was one of the smartest guys I've ever met, but probably more Christ-like than anybody I've ever met. All at the same time. Patience and kindness and soft words, and but razor sharp intellect. But he never used it as a cutting instrument. Yeah, sure. He was he just glowed for Jesus no matter where he went, and the Lord's power was with him in dramatic ways. I wrote a book called 5 Sacred Crossings, and it's got a main character. It's a novel, and it's got a main character named Michael Jernigan. And I must say, I'd say 70 to 75% of this character, I had Dallas Willard in mind all the time as I wrote this story. So he had a tremendous impact.
Yeah, brilliant. And how did things work out for you as you were what kind of happened as you tried to press into doing a secular academic type career?
Yeah, the Lord had just had other plans. And I wound up back at that funny little school I mentioned earlier, Simon Greenleaf University. I was running a graduate program in Christian Apologetics.
Right.
And working my tail off, too, to do it because it was a struggling school. It got absorbed by another institution that wasn't particularly keen on apologetics. And so I started a partnership with Biola University in Southern California, and they just embraced me with open arms and let me run wild, starting a new graduate program in Christian apologetics on their campus. And it's still probably the fastest growing program on that campus.
So how long has it been running then, the apologetics program?
15 years.
15 years, yeah. And I guess in that time, have you felt like more and more churches and Christians are looking for reasoned defense of the faith?
Oh, yes. I tell my students that this apologetics thing is a growth industry. Offering reasons for faith, giving people good evidence is something that we need to do now more than ever, and churches are recognizing that. That's the real key, is they come to us now. We used to go to them and try to persuade them that this would be an important, not just tool for evangelism and answering tough questions and fulfilling that great command in 1 Peter to give people reasons, but also as a way of grounding their own people in the faith and discipling them. I mean, it's very difficult to live big for Jesus if you're not quite sure if it's all true. Sure, I've had an experience, but is it true in an objective sense? Can I really go out and study this and discover it to be true? The answer is yes. And that's the message. So this is a growth industry. Secular culture is encroaching on church territory like never before. And so church leaders are a little bit alarmed. So they're looking for people who have some good reasons and good character, too, to learn these things from.
So tell us about family.
Well, I've been married to Karen for 29 years. I have 4 kids. I think my oldest daughter is 24 now. My goodness. then a 22-year-old daughter, and then 19-year-old twin boys. And both my wife and I, we grew up in non-Christian homes. So sometimes we have to ask our children, so what's it like growing up in a Christian home? And I must say, because my wife and I didn't know what we were doing because we had seen no modeling in our own families. We just kind of groped about,
learning on the job,
trying to figure it out. But the Lord has blessed that. I think we didn't over religiousize our kids.
Sure.
I think they just love Jesus and they understand that it's true, and that's an amazing grounding for kids to do well in life.
I mean, when it comes to Biola, which stands, as I understand it, for the Bible Institute of Los Angeles.
Yes.
But they offer a wide variety of courses and things, but all within a kind of Christian framework of the campus and so on. We don't really have that here in the UK as such, as sort of what you might call a Christian university in that sense. Is that a good thing, or are there any drawbacks to kind of potentially being in a kind of Christian bubble to some extent? What's your experience on that front?
Oh, that's such a good question for me, because I didn't go to any Christian universities. It's all secular training for me, and I really enjoyed being the lone Christian on the dark secular campus. I don't know, that actually brought me closer to the Lord than about anything else could. And so I enjoyed that. And my experience at Biola was I was running a graduate program, and so it's a little bit removed from the typical undergraduate days. But all of my kids, my 2 boys just finished their freshman year, and my girls who are older have gone through and graduated, and I have come to so appreciate what goes on at a Christian college campus. One that really does it right. One that takes the it's not just all memorizing Bible verses, but you can major in sociology or biochemistry. And sure, there's a Christian foundation to it all, and there's Christian integration into every subject. And so there's wonderful learning from top flight thinkers in each of those fields. So there's no slacking in terms of what they're going to get vis-a-vis a secular university like UC Berkeley or someplace. But more importantly, is this amazing Christian nurture that's going on. day to day. Anybody who wants to grow in the Lord, anybody who wants to be passionate about following Jesus and really doing something big for the kingdom has every opportunity in the world at a place like Biola to learn what they need to do and to see it modeled by just amazing, thoughtful Christian professors.
Yeah. Obviously, my main way that I've interacted with Biola is through your apologetics program, and you've got a wonderful range of speakers and authors who are involved there. Tell us, what are you trying to do with the students who come through? What kind of are they going away with? What kind of a toolbox are you trying to equip them with? I guess it depends on what they're hoping to do with it afterwards, I guess.
It really does. I think we have a first-rank curriculum. It's general apologetics, but we've created a curriculum that's so flexible that people can really specialize in what they'd like. We have students who are really digging deeply into philosophical apologetics, others who are digging into historical apologetics. They really want to be able to defend the New Testament documents and the resurrection of Jesus and so on. We do a pretty good job in cultural apologetics, trying to figure out how the big Christian ideas play out through popular culture and classical culture, and how to make connections with people where they are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So would that mean looking at the way films are kind of resonating with certain themes that reflect Christian doctrine and that kind of thing?
Right. And most importantly, this, I really encourage my students to think more broadly than just learning some philosophy and history, but then how to clearly communicate that to people in a way that penetrates, and a way that's not using philosophical and historical and academic jargon.
Sure.
So I actually tried that myself by writing a novel, called Five Sacred Crossings. And I got to tell you, I am not a professional novelist, so I really appreciate those who dedicate their lives to such things, because I was a bit of a dabbler in this. But nonetheless, more people have read that book than anything I've written in terms of, traditional academic work.
Yes, sure, absolutely. And that's where most people are. Most Christians are not probably going to take a sort of in-depth sort of degree in philosophy, but they'll still want to know how to answer their friend across the road who says, well, I read this online the other day that Jesus doesn't even exist.
Yes.
And what do I do? And so is there the kind of what's your program offering to that kind of level at which people want to engage, where they can't come for a term and do a whole program, but they'd like some good answers to those kinds of typical questions?
It's funny because when we started the program 15 years ago, we said we got to have something for everybody, and I think we do. We not only have a first-rank graduate program that sends people off into teaching positions and doctoral programs and so on, but we have a certificate program. And it's based on some lecture series that we had on campus a number of years ago. And it is first rate. I'd call it, well, let's put it this way. If you do the certificate program through Biola, you will rise to the top 5% of religiously literate people in the world. Now, okay, there's a little catch here. Some people say, wow, that must be some certificate program you have there. I say, well, it's a wonderful certificate program. But the comment is really about the incredibly low level of understanding out in the general public.
Yes.
So my message is, people, don't be afraid to learn this stuff. Just by even engaging a little bit of study, reading some good books, listening to some good podcasts and MP3s and so on, you will really get a leg up and be able to turn the tables in the conversation. Rather than feeling defensive and not having answers, suddenly you'll be able to very kindly and respectfully ask people some hard questions about their view of the world.
I mean, in my experience, lots of Christians who do get into apologetics get into it because their own faith has been challenged at some level by a friend or colleague or others. I mean, even as an as someone who knows this field so well now, Craig, have there over the years been any kind of moments when you thought, God, that's a really good objection, I'm not sure I know the answer to that, or anything that's even made you sort of lay awake at night thinking, I've got to get to the bottom of this, those kinds of issues?
I kind of wish there had been. I would feel more authentic or something, But
if you'd had a dark night of the soul at some point,
right.
but do you feel though then, in that sense, that you've really seen all the arguments that more or less exist out there?
I got to tell you, one thing that really helped seal the deal for me over the long run was doing graduate work in religious studies and having an opportunity to really study Buddhism, for instance, and Islam and Mormonism and you name it. And I gotta agree with Peter, his little answer to Jesus in John chapter 6. Jesus is saying some really hard stuff. You got to eat my flesh and you got to drink my blood. And nobody's understanding what he's talking about. And people are walking away. And Peter goes, Jesus wheels around to the 12 and he says, are you going to leave too? And Peter goes, well, where else are we going to go?
You have the words of eternal life. Yeah.
And you know what he's saying there? He's saying, I've heard those other guys who've come through town. If it were in my life, it was the Buddha, and Joseph Smith and so on. And they didn't hold a candle to what Jesus has to offer. So although I don't think I have all the answers in the world, I've kind of looked at the answers offered by the other great contenders for my religious attention, and they just don't add up. They don't stack up.
Yeah. I mean, you've spent years looking at the rational case for faith, for Christ. How does that work when it comes to going back to that first experience you had, which was what first drew you into Christianity? Do you still look for an experience of Christ as well as kind of understanding Christ with your brain?
Bring it on, God, man. Give me all the experience you have for me. I want it all. I want to be shaking in a puddle on the floor. I'm not kidding. He's a personal God, and he interacts with us personally. And he doesn't do that with me often. I'm not wired like that. My wife is. She senses those kinds of things all the time. But the few times it has, they have been like great points of remembrance for me, that he's a personal God who can not only satisfy my mind, but can touch me personally and deeply. And I say bring it on.
Because I think that's always the danger, isn't it? That we can focus on one thing to the neglect of the other.
That's right.
And if we make apologetics our end goal, we maybe lose the fact that this is actually about bringing people close to a personal God.
Yes, and I do run a graduate program that attracts people who have a very rational approach to the faith, and we spend a good deal of time trying to moderate that. We have classes in spiritual formation and discipleship that we want to emphasize the part of the great apostolic command in 1 Peter 3:15 that says to do these things, offer your answers with respect and humility and reverence. We want to make sure our students do that. Otherwise, they're simply a gong or a clanging cymbal, and nobody's really paying attention.
Absolutely. It's been wonderful to talk with you today, Craig. Thank you very much for
my
joining
great
me
pleasure.
on the programme. And don't forget, you can find more interviews with leading Christians in all areas of life, arts, politics, sport, media at Christianity Magazine. Visit the website, get yourself a free copy of the magazine. Until next time, have a good week.